I'd like to introduce Charles Jamieson, who's a board-certified marital and family law attorney in West Palm Beach, Florida, who has, Charlie says he does the very difficult cases that he has to do dumpster diving on that nobody else wants. They involve alienation, high conflict divorce, really difficult kinds of work that a lot of attorneys aren't willing to take on, and we're very fortunate to have him in our state. So Charlie, if you would like to say a few words, we'd appreciate it.
Good evening, thank you for having me. Just to give you a brief update of what's going on in Tallahassee, is that it appears that the House of Representatives, or the lower chamber, is going to pass the bill as it stands. It has to go through one more committee, but it seems to be assured to do so. But in order for a bill to become law, it has to pass both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So what's happening in the Senate is that there is a procedures committee. The procedures committee then has a concern about, is a statute constitutional, whereas as the statute is written, does it have a chance of passing? They are concerned about the constitutionality of the Senate bill as it's written. I think that's based upon the long-standing Florida case law that requires a high standard of harm to be proved in order for grandparents to intercede and to have contact / time sharing or visitation, as it used to be called, or to obtain custody of their children. Currently, there are only 3 limited ways in which that can occur. This statute broadens that substantially. I've spoken to your representative, the aide to the representative. We're sending some more materials up there tonight, once we adjourn, and hopefully that will be. We're hoping that this material will be sufficient to convince the Procedures Committee that the statute on its face, or as you read it, does pass constitutional muster. I think they will be able to do so, so the statute should pass, or at least pass through the Procedures Committee. It has to go through 3 or 4 committee meetings or hearings after that before it's presented to the Senate for voting. So we're still in the run on this. But again, phone calls, letters, emails are always important at these critical junctures because the legislatures do look at them. The legislatures do count. So don't think that just because you're one person, you can't have an impact. If everyone does reach out to their representatives and to their senators in the state of Florida, then the bill will proceed forward. I'm here also to add into our guest speakers as we go through the night. Usually as an attorney, I'm on the opposite side of the courtroom. Fortunately, with these 2 professionals, I've not had that displeasure. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them in cases I've been involved in. I have some sign-up sheets in the back of the room if anyone's interested. Our office does a monthly newsletter dealing with various issues concerning family law, including grandparents. We're also publishing an e-book on parental alienation, and although it's not grandparent alienation, it's similar. So if you would like to have a free copy of the e-book, please sign up. It's at the back of the room. Thank you.
And now we'd like to introduce our dynamic duo. We always call Dr. Bone and Dr. Caddy our dynamic duo, and they certainly are both extremely well educated, very experienced experts, international experts in the field of high conflict divorce and parental alienation, and also now grandparent alienation. Dr. Glenn Ross Caddy, PhD, psychologist, is a clinical and forensic psychology and behavioral medicine practice founded in 1984 that has both national and international exposure because of the scope of the work that he undertakes. The practice serves as the United States headquarters of the telemedicine organization Mind Experts International. Dr. Caddy is licensed as a clinical psychologist in Florida, USA, and is likewise nationally licensed throughout Australia. He has consulted in several Australian states and in more than 20 states in the United States. He has in addition undertaken forensic consultations throughout the U.S., in several provinces in Canada and the United Kingdom, in Norway, Bahamas, Argentina, El Salvador, and via video conferencing to many other places around the globe. He holds fellowships and is board certified in the specialties of clinical psychology, forensic psychology, behavioral medicine, and human sexuality. He has also undertaken postdoctoral training in neuropsychology and is certified nationally as a custody evaluator and parental coordinator. Equally accomplished is Dr. J. Michael Bone, PhD in Winter Park, Florida. So Dr. Bone has spent over 25 years working with high conflict divorce as a therapist, expert witness, mediator, evaluator, and consultant, both nationally and internationally. Dr. Bone provides litigation-related consultation for lawyers, parents, and others needing a review of court cases, court files, and recommendations. He is based out of Central Florida, Winter Park. The primary focus of my work in the last 20 or so years is that of high conflict custody disputes within the context of divorce where parental alienation appears to be present. I work with parents, grandparents, lawyers, and other professionals who may be involved in the case. Dr. Bone began his career as a mental health professional, helping people of all genres in all areas of their lives, and especially divorce. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Bone and Dr. Glenn Caddy.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm sure Glenn and Charlie feel exactly the same way. As far as I believe there's a fair amount of understanding and expertise about alienation in the room. Is that accurate? We don't need to do 101, or do we? No. I mean, you understand the difference between alienation and estrangement. Estrangement is when a parent acts badly and the child doesn't want to see the parent because of that parent's behavior. Alienation is due to the influence of the other parent. Interestingly enough, as a little side note, research also shows that when children really are abused by a parent, guess how they act? Not like alienated kids. Abused children typically gravitate toward the abusive parent. And the fact that mental health professionals, the garden variety mental health professionals that don't have a specialty in this, routinely get that wrong. They routinely think that, well, if a child doesn't want to see a parent, it's because they claim it's because of that parent's, I don't like their cooking, or they clean up too much or not enough, or I don't like the way they talk, that's reasonable. And it's to me still astounding that is considered, that's a phenomenon that we see all the time. A big part of what I do, and I know Glenn does, and Charlie in a different role, is basically have to go and undo the work of clinicians that probably mean well, but they get it completely wrong. And it's predictable that they will do that. And we'll talk more about, well, there is an explanation for that. They're not just naive. I mean, the way we're wired as humans, it's very easy to get this wrong. So at some point we'll talk more about that. But I'm tempted to give the microphone to Glenn now, because maybe I'll talk about that for just a moment, the counterintuitive thing. Think about what happens when somebody comes in a clinician's office. You got to say a mother or a father, it could be either, it's about 50-50 now, and comes into an office and it says, with hands raised, "Doc, my kid just doesn't want to see their parent. I wish they did, but they just don't. I don't know why." Well, maybe I know why. Maybe that's because they yell and scream all the time, or they do all sorts of things, and then they have a litany of those things. To the casual observer, you have this adult parent and these children who seem very closely bonded, like they're really connected at the hip. It looks healthy. In actuality, it's an unhealthy form of enmeshment, where there are no healthy boundaries between the two, and the children become an extension of the parent. Then the targeted parent comes in, the one the children don't want to see, and this parent has lost their kid. They've been traumatized by that. They've been accused of all kinds of things they didn't do, so they don't look too good. I mean, they've been traumatized, so they come into the office, they're seen by the clinician, who's heard all about them now, and they go, and they're uneasy, they're kind of awkward, they don't answer questions in a flowing kind of way that suggests they're comfortable, so it tends to reinforce the position and the bias that the therapist has already been given. So you can see how it's just like it just rolls on and on and on. It's very easy to do. I mean, a big part of what I do is when there'll be a case where a clinician, otherwise very competent forensic psychologist, will do an evaluation like Glenn will typically do. Even very competent forensic evaluators will get this wrong if they don't have a specific understanding about this dynamic and how it works. So we see that all the time. I mean, all the time. So we talked about this earlier at dinner. There are a precious few that a big part of what I do is find evaluators to do the evaluations. We've got Glenn, and we've got a few other people in the state, but it is difficult to find ones, as strange as that sounds. So we're in the educating process now of trying to educate psychologists, mental health professionals in that process. I see a lot of you nodding as we're going through this, so I know some of you have experienced this and so forth. So I'm going to take a break right now. Yeah.
Let me just address that for a few moments. The dilemma that you get into in dealing with people in my field is that just because they're psychologists and just because they're licensed doesn't mean they don't know anything. They may know something about something, but they don't know about what they don't know. And that's true of us all. And so what we're really looking at here is people who have gone through university studies and they've learned all of the various courseworks and things like that they're supposed to know, but they haven't had exposure to these situations. Or if they have, they don't realize it. Because what they're likely to be doing is providing treatment services to, for example, a mother and children because dad's terrible. And they don't want to see the child, the mother is sort of bringing them in or alternatively, because their children are having problems. And so mum brings them in, and it could be dad brings them in, it doesn't matter for the purpose of the exercise. But the consequence is that the therapy starts, and it starts inaccurately, because the clinician has no idea what the ultimate cause of developments are, and he or she is likely not to do this sort of digging. That's why Michael called it dumpster diving, because you sometimes have to get right down to the bottom of things before you understand what's happening. And that is typical, and this is one of the problems that you face in the courtroom too, because in court examinations, many psychologists, that's not simply their clinical discipline. That requires then an interface with the forensic discipline, the interface with the legal system, the interface with Charlie. And the reality is many people who may be pretty adequate clinicians are absolutely lost in that arena. They are outmaneuvered in that arena because they're not experienced with it. But that doesn't mean that they won't enter it. It means that they may enter it in a whole variety of cases and be able to do a relatively competent job. And the more skilled they are, the better the job. But when they start dealing with this counterintuitive sort of system that applies in alienation, they are truly lost. I'm involved in a case at the moment. I might as well tell you a quick war story. I'm actively involved in it right now. This is a case in which there are 4 children. The case is in Vancouver, BC, British Columbia. The father makes around between $10 and $15 million a month. The marriage is a 20-year marriage that probably should have ended 15 years ago. Yeah. The father, over the last, for most of the marriage, he was having an affair. Over the last 7 or 8 years, he has progressively disconnected from his wife because after she found out about the affair, she wasn't terribly interested in him anymore. But she's staying for the purpose of the interest of the children. There are 4 children. In this particular case, the father did things like, for example, Mum wanted to take them to an island, the Galapagos Islands, because the father was always taking them to incredibly expensive, now it's pretty expensive to go to the Galapagos, but these 4 girls were getting $200 massages every day. They didn't just go to the average place, they went to the most expensive places you can go. And so, as you might suspect, they're sort of spoiled. In any regard, what he decided to do was align himself with the oldest daughter. The oldest daughter is 6 foot tall, mother is 5'5". She is beautiful. She's not very smart. And you could say, well, 2 or 3 aren't bad, but what's actually happened is that 2 of the other children are really intelligent. But she was very influential because she's older. And he just sort of sat back and manipulated her to dislike her mother intensely, find every fault that she could with her, and progressively influenced the next oldest child. That process persisted. So he sort of sat back and allowed it to happen, encouraged it by default. But then what happened is he started upping the ante a little bit, because it was clear to him that mother was so disconnected she wasn't coming back. And when the family therapy ended and she said, "I'm done," by that stage of the game there were other things going on in the family. One of them was the conspiracy between the oldest daughter and the next oldest daughter and the father was so profound that she was able to record meetings of them, plotting in various sorts of ways. And on one of those meetings, she got caught recording it through a door, because she finally hired a lawyer, and she was seeing a mental health expert, and she was going to give them proof of this because people weren't believing her. Well, that would have been fine, except one of the 6 foot daughter and the next one is 5'10", the father is 6'3", decided to come out of the door, saw her taping, tackled her to the ground, knocked her senseless, took the tape, went and erased it. Meanwhile, she rushes into her room, calls not 911, because whatever it is up in Canada, and the police are there within about 5 or 6 minutes. 5 police cars pull up, and what happens thereafter is that they construct this beautiful fiction that she wasn't injured, she attacked them. So just as an inference. Now let me just add one other element about how this worked. Now, obviously, this worked in an exceptionally wealthy family. It wouldn't work in somebody that wasn't. The father decided, on this story about the Galapagos, Mum decided that she wanted to try one more time, 2 years ago, to get them some sort of exposure to a wonderful natural experience instead of one more spa. And she convinced the father, because he didn't really want her to leave. He was too busy manipulating her for that. He didn't want her to leave, so he agreed. And then what happens is 3 days before the trip, now this is a non-refundable $45,000 deposit. That all. Oh, well, it gets better. The oldest daughter says, "I'm not going." I wonder what would happen to my daughter if she tried to pull that. Anyway, then, in response to that, the second oldest said, "I'm not going either." The father said, "Well, I'm not going to go." The mother said, with tears in her eyes, "Well, I'll take the other 2. Guess what the father said? "No, you won't." So, what did he do to make up for the hideousness of not going to the Galapagos? Wait for it. Over the next 18 days, he spent $415,000 in a large private jet, tripping them to 4 different places around the world. How do you beat that one? So that's an absurdity, but it illustrates in certain respects this game of alienation. And in wealthy people, money often plays a substantial role in it. In less wealthy people, money sometimes still plays a role, but then you have all of the other, all the other manipulations that are engaged in the process. And they are all fundamentally evil. They are absolutely inconsistent with, and I'm not a particular Bible thumper, but there are things in the Bible that I think represent wonderful value in terms of truisms of life. And one of them is the concept of, honour thy mother and thy father, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Well, in the case of the not bearing false witness, that gets blown quite out of the way in the whole arena of parental alienation. And one other thing I want to make a point about. There is parental alienation that goes all the way up to murder. There's parental alienation that exists on a continuum. And so what we need to understand is that it doesn't have to be extreme in order to be extremely dangerous. And so a lot of the work that I do around the country and in other places is I spend a lot of my time working, being hired after everything has gone wrong. My job sometimes, Charlie and I have had some cases together where it was only gone wrong. It had only gone wrong a little while, but in other instances, the case in Canada, for example, is a good example because there a court-appointed expert had all of the children taken away from mother because she was convinced that mother was being abusive to them. And now we have to reverse that process, and we're doing it. But my goodness, it's hard work. And the court-appointed expert spent a total of 12 hours in investigation of the situation. 4 hours directly, 4 hours and only 4 with mum, 4 hours and only 4 with dad, and 4 hours with the 4 children. So far, my work in that case has exceeded 120 hours. Now, thank God they've got money. I don't mean that just to be so I can make money. Thank God that they have the resources to be able to bring resources to bear. But the reality of it is the case is now so complex, and the courts expert always comes in with an advantage, unless they really screw up. And in this case, she has really screwed up. But proving to the court that the court's expert is wrong, especially when I have an Australian accent, she has a Canadian one, is going to be an interesting exercise. We haven't got there yet, but we have tremendous amounts of data. I've interviewed, I think it's about 27 people. The court's expert interviewed the 4 principals and 2 mental health providers and a Department of Social Services investigator. So that's what we talk about when we talk about it. And I've not used this before, but I think I'm going to adopt it. Michael we had something to eat before we came in today. And Michael sort of said, you really do have to dumpster dive in some of this work. And it's absolutely true, because if you just dive into the surface, you'll get lost. You'll just believe what everybody else looks at and sees. So, let me turn this back.
Let me add that, just react to that. Back to that counterintuitive thing. You can see if someone does an inadequate evaluation, spend a few hours, they just skim across the top, and that's all they see. So the kind of investigation that's required for one of these things really has to drill down very deeply into detail. If you read an evaluation that says, well, he said this, she said that, the truth's somewhere in the middle, bad evaluation. The forensic evaluator is really obligated to find out what really happened, not what their sense of the truth is, but what really happened in a case. And that so often is woefully inadequate the way they're done. So if someone does just sort of the garden variety, 4 hours here, 4 hours there, and that might even be generous for some of these, that's what they're going to get is the top 5%. It's going to tell the story just exactly backwards. So
let me make the point that just because of the hideous amount of time involved in this case doesn't mean that all of them are that way. Many are vastly less time intensive than that. The dilemma is that when you get into some of these cases where folks have got a lot of money, they've got a lot of money to play games. They also can hire expensive lawyers who are artful at participating in that exercise. And, you know, I would like to turn this over to Charlie for a moment, because one of the things that he and I have done and that he does he hires other experts, and he's got a lot of these sorts of cases. You know, he comes in with an honest orientation to understand what's really going on. Now, that's sort of, don't mean to question lawyers, but that can be a bit of an oxymoron in a sense, because a lawyer, if they take a case, are obliged to serve the interests of their client. But when kids are concerned, that gets a little bit more difficult to pull off sometimes. And so one of the things that I'd be very interested in having, you know, Charlie tell us is how he approaches these sorts of things, and how some of the work that he does varies from some of the work that often we see in custody evaluation style work.
Thanks. When you're in a high conflict case, my attitude is the black sheep is coming out sometime. And if your client's a black sheep, you better know about it before you walk in the courtroom. So my attitude is, tell me what you want to achieve, then let me dig around in this and I can tell you whether you can or not. Because if I discover it's a black sheep, it's my client, my job is then to provide my client the best representation I can and the best exit strategy, because the judge is not interested in the best interest of my client. The judge is interested in the best interest of the child. So the real battle when there's parental alienation is going on is, how do we as a team, myself, my client, and the forensic team I have, or the court psychologist if one's appointed, how do we present the case in an understandable, simplistic form for the judge to comprehend? And the reason I say that is not in any disrespect to judges. Judges have overwhelming dockets. They see all kinds of people problems. They have limited periods of time in which to digest your case and figure out what should be done. So you need to be able to give it to them, your side of the case to them, or what's going on with parental alienation, in bites of information that are comprehensible in a simplistically understood fashion, and give them the result that's needed. Don't let them try to guess what should occur. Don't let them pick among a choice, a spectrum. Tell them what has to work. So my question now to the experts is, how do you present your cases or your analysis so the judge will, what I call, pull the trigger? In other words, call parental alienation what it is and give the relief to the children and the alienated parent that they need.
yeah, I've got a thought right now. It'll go away if I don't say it. So one thing I really have come to believe, we talked about this briefly at dinner, every time the court gets it right, every time, and even in a really complex alienation case that's evolved to the severe level, every time the court gets it right, one thing happens, always, and I can think of no exception, and that is the alienating parent gets exposed. Because if you think about it, all the focus is on the targeted parent. Is this guy okay? Did he really do that? He seemed like a nice guy, but she said that's what he seems like, but that's not really, but here's all this stuff. So the focus is on the targeted parent. But once you finally realize that what's going on and you begin to go after, and I mean go after, in a respectful way, but in a way that is fact-based in terms of, because I suggest developing a tool that I affectionately call the lie list. Because people that do this lie. And it's a matter of pinning down the inconsistencies that can be easily proven without dispute, using that in a real laser-pointed way to get the court to understand what's going on. And once that happens, I've been in the courtroom, you can see the light bulb go on in the judge, and they start looking, you know how the judge is up here, and there's a table over here, and a table over here, and the alienating parent's over there, and they've been looking over here, now they start looking over there. And you can actually really see it. So that's one point I wanted to make. You really have to, I stress that with every case I get involved in. And there was some other point, but it's gone now. So.
Let's all just stand here and wait for it to come back. Put him on the hot spot. Okay. Shall we? Realistically, from my point of view, the task of sorting out what's going on, no matter how complex it is, there's a protocol. And that is that it's my job in a case like this to do comprehensive examinations of all of the relevant people. And at every point, ask myself, what really makes sense here? There's a premise. And I suggest if you follow this, you will not go too far wrong. All human behavior makes sense. All of it. Even the most pathological. If only you can come to understand the dynamics that are driving it. And sometimes there seems to be a tremendous paradox in what you see versus what you're being told, etc., etc. But if we just follow the premise that all human behavior makes sense, I do some work on death row. All human behavior makes sense if only you understand the dynamics that are driving it. And so, if I don't understand what's going on in a case, or something doesn't feel right to me, my job is to persist until it makes sense. And if I can't do that, I'm not doing my job properly. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who don't worry about that edict. They do their job at a superficial level. They come up with a conclusion. And then somebody like me has to come in and try and scratch their head and say, I've got to do this again. You know, and that happens time after time after time. The condition, one of the things that I also want to say about children is that they're pretty malleable. But if they've had a relationship, for example, with a grandparent, for a reasonable amount of time, maybe enough time so that they have really bonded with that grandparent. Maybe they're 5, maybe they're 7, maybe they're 8. Probably if they're 3, might work, but by 5, 6, if they've had a lot of exposure to a grandparent, and then the alienation starts. Initially, they may well and truly buy into the alienation because the influence of the parent, especially the alienating parent, is so penultimate. But one of the things I'd like you to consider, that deep down in that relationship, there's a kid who used to adore you. And believe it or not, that still exists under this overlay. I've been involved in cases, for example, where I thought that the recovery process was going to take an awful long time, where the level of resistance in the child was really quite severe when it came to refusing to see a parent or a grandparent. However, that dissolved very soon after seeing the parent. We didn't need 10 more hours of therapy between parent and child, because often within an hour, that underlying bond was flowing through again. There was this awareness back in history, an awareness that's based more on emotion than actual detailed recollection. And that's a pretty beautiful thing to see, and it's an amazing process. The child, however, who themselves has been profoundly alienated. That is, if they've just been, if the other parent alienates the parent, but the children are dragged along with it and they are not profoundly impacted. That is, if your grandchildren are not seeing you anymore and your daughter or son has been successfully disengaged from you, don't necessarily believe that if you've had a good relationship with the grandchildren, that they're an abject part of that. They may have almost nothing to do with it. They just go along with what is. And and that's a very important thing to understand. And you also see that in the other thing that you see, it's the same sort of thing that you see. I do a lot of work also in the area of mind control. And in mind control, you often, you see that a lot in, well, you see it routinely in cults, not a lot. You always see it in cults. But there, once the light bulb goes off, and sometimes take a lot of, electricity for the light bulb to go off, but once that's happened, all of a sudden the transformation kicks back in again. And we start to see a normalization of the relationship. I had a young woman who was so alienated from her parents by a profoundly disturbed stepbrother, who was 11 years older than she, and they started a sexual relationship when she was 13 and he was 24. He succeeded, I know you find it hard to believe, he succeeded in getting her mother to allow them to go and live with his mother, who happened to be worth $500 million. And what happened thereafter is that he used religion and manipulation, because the child had grown up in a quite religious family. Didn't stop her having sex with him at 14. But the religious component became so powerful that at age 21, she started having psychotic episodes, believing that God was talking to her. And then she gave birth to a baby. And 10 months later, God instructed her, if you love me, you will throw the baby down on the stones. She killed her baby. I got to see her 3 days after she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. We actually got her off not guilty by reason of insanity. And believe it or not, today she works in Florida for the Department of Children and Family Services. And she is absolutely healthy and normal. But my point is, that's an extreme case of craziness induced by profound manipulation. I can give you lots of other examples. But that is also a beautiful example of the ability to recover completely, because her psychosis did not come about as a result of some biogenetic phenomenon. It came about through the manipulation of her mind and her inability to control it. So, something to think about.
It came back. About 20 years ago, it's one of the first times I saw this phenomenon. Well, similar to what you're saying. There was a father who had been alienated. He was a criminal attorney and a kind of a nefarious character. I got to know him fairly well, but he was a great father. His daughter was 12 years old. She had not seen him for 9 months. The mother had successfully kept him away. The court appointed a guardian ad litem and then appointed me to get them back together. So the mother would expected to bring the child to the office where then I would have the father come in. I said, no, I don't want the mother to do that. I want the guardian to do it. I don't want the mother on the other side of the wall influencing what goes on inside. So the child came in. She knew what was going to happen. I had a chair in my office at that time that you could swivel in, and she swiveled and faced the corner and wouldn't say a word. And about 10 minutes later, her father comes in. And he'd been accused of not actually sexual molestation, but there was an innuendo of that. There was something that went on, but it wasn't charged or anything like that, but it was definitely in the air. And anyway, what happened was he came in, she's still faced in the corner, mute, not saying a word. And I kid you not, within about 15 minutes, they were both sitting on the couch, and it was like nothing had ever happened. I mean, it was just like, whoa, how does this happen? When you take someone out of that ether, out of that influence, you can see it come back rather spontaneously. So what Glenn said earlier, even when you see things on the surface, alienation is a surface phenomenon. You know, when kids are told inaccurate things about a parent, they're instructed, oh, you did this, or they overhear, oh, your father didn't want you to be born, or whatever it was. All these things, you hear the same things over and over. That is learned through hearing or sort of being instructed. That's a different part of your brain. The part of the lower part, so to speak, that comes from experience and having interaction with that parent, operates at a deeper level, involved in the limbic system and all kinds of things that are less involved in that instructional thing. Your father did this. So on the surface, you got this alienation thing, but underneath, it's there. I mean, it's there. And I think that's especially important for grandparents to understand. And I think a lot of time is important, but the quality of the time is probably even more important. We've seen that there seems to be good evidence for that. So I mean, just recognizing that you keep throwing the little seeds out there, and they will sometimes, then very often, they will spontaneously sort of germinate. So it's there, and that's important to understand. That was, to me, I still think back when that kid's sitting there, and then 15 minutes later they're joking around. It kind of blew me away. I thought, they're putting me on or something. But that was, and to this day, it still can happen like that when the court has the ability to extract a child from that environment and put them away from that environment, and they're not influenced. It's astounding how quickly that can be reversed. There are 2 programs in North America that take severely alienated kids, and typically within about 4 days, even severely alienated kids are singing a different tune as long as there's no contact with the alienating parent. So that's that's astounding to me. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but that's the way it is, because it really is a surface phenomenon. But it's their job to convince you it's the truth. You going to say something?
I'm just thinking that the alienating, we're grandparents, the alienating adult child, the one that's controlling the mind of our child,
Yes.
they're still there.
Yes.
So even though the children love us, want to see us, they really do love us under there,
Mm-hmm.
that toxic person is still around. You don't get rid of that toxic person. That's still
Well, as Richard Gardner, I think very correctly said, the dynamic that drives alienation is fear. And it's fear of the alienating parent. I mean, an alienated kid will say, oh, I'm afraid, I don't want to see dad, I'm afraid of it. But really what's going on is they're afraid of displeasing mom. Or if that's, or it could be the other way around. So it's a fear-driven dynamic. So when that source of the fear is still there in the environment, that alienation part is still going to be active.
And
Yeah.
then will they do this? Will they do this in their generation when they grow up? Will
They could. I mean, I've seen that happen. I mean, I've certainly seen that happen. It depends, and sometimes it happens. The grandchildren will then grow up and have their own families, and at about the same age it happened to them, there'll be this spontaneous kind of, after when they have children, they may have to wait. Then there can be lots of other spontaneous things. I guess that's the point I want to make. Spontaneous things can happen that will make this come about, because it is really there. That's why it's important to know that, so that when you're treated horribly and ignored, put it away, you know. So.
What you're confronting now is similar in some aspects to what I was seeing in the 1990s, when there were parents or grandparents were being confronted by their adult children for newly discovered memories of being abused or mistreated as children. And therefore they would cut off contact with the grandchildren to the grandparents. What we found over time with dealing with those grandparents was those grandparents who remained open and sent whatever communications they could to say, we're still here, we still love you. Eventually, many of those adult children came back to those parents because over time they realized that these newly discovered memories weren't real memories, and that what really was underneath them all was the love and respect that the parents had actually shown to them. So what does that mean for you all? What that means is whatever contact that you can get it. Make sure a message is communicated if it's appropriate and legal to do so, that you're available there at any time. and don't turn your back. It's easy for us to become embittered. It's easy to say, I didn't do this, I shouldn't have to deal with it, and turn your back and walk away and everything. But remaining open and time right now are your best allies. And hopefully a newly passed statute will help you also.
You know, one of the first books written on this in I don't know, right around the time of Gardner, maybe, was a book called Children Held Hostage. That was actually commissioned by the American Bar Association. They studied 700 divorces and found a very high incidence of this dynamic. But I think the title says it all. I mean, that's really what we have is hostage taking. That's really what's going on. It's so important to remember that. It doesn't seem that way. It's counterintuitive. It looks like this mean little kid that used to be so sweet is now acting horribly. That's not what's going on.
I think it's also important that we need to realise that in virtually, delete the word virtually, in every case where you have this phenomenon taking place, the alienator is a truly disturbed person. I mean, there's nothing, they may be sophisticated, they may be a whole lot of things, but they are truly disturbed. Because they've bought into a value system and an orientation and a belief that they benefit from in a truly pathological way. It's how they maintain control. And if one has to maintain control through strategies such as that, ultimately they get to be seen as ultimately very weak people. And many of them are quite mentally disturbed. I had another case in Canada in which another wealthy man who was incredibly manipulative, and he ended up three of his children. There were four kids. Three of his children got away when the wife said, "I'm done." What caused her to say, "I'm done," was he beat her. And the police arrived at the house to find blood on a wall where she'd been slammed into it and bleeding. They arrested him. She got away, and a fight broke out, a legal fight broke out, because he wanted the kids and she wanted the kids. But one of the children, this was very early on in the alienation stuff, long before all of this was fully worked out, before we have become as educated as now we have. And he was an interesting man for other reasons. He was a US citizen who'd escaped to Canada with some $20 million in tax debt. So he already had his problems, and he had to stay in Canada. And interestingly, it's not all that easy for the United States to extradite a person on tax violations. And so he spent several $1 million in trying to avoid being extradited. But guess how he succeeded? Because he had a Canadian child. And he kept that daughter. He would do anything to continue the alienation of that child because she kept him able to stay in Canada. That child, I kept in touch with the rest of the family. I got hired because the mother's mother had seen me in therapy a few years before, and I kept in touch with her to some degree, or she with me. And it seems like the oldest child, all the other three children moved. The woman remarried. She now lives with her husband in San Francisco. Those three children excelled. The other child had a pregnancy at 16, had an aborted pregnancy, and started a pattern of street drug culturing. She also made arrangements to provide prostitutes to her father, who died from his own drug overdose, probably about 7 or 8 years ago. So he had a great deal of success and a great deal of failure. But fortunately, at least 3 of the children were able to escape, or the mother was able to get 3 of the children to escape. Now, one other comment for you folks, because of the grandparent situation. Bad as it is, one of the things that sometimes happens, and one of the things that you might pray for, is a dissolution of marriage. And because I'm sure you do, because if what I'm telling you is true, and I promise you it is, sometimes you can, there's that story, you can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all the time. Well, there's some truth to that in these marital relationships. The only difficulty is that some of these alienators are so successful in controlling so much of the air that the other person breathes that they don't seem to be able to breathe without that person. As we were coming across the alley, Charlie and I were telling war stories, and I told him about a serial alienator, a woman, who alienated her first 2 children by marrying her second husband and convincing him that the first husband was no good. And she had 5 more children with the second husband. And then she alienated him, and that's how I got into the scene. Now, however, much as I tried to accomplish the impossible back then, this is like 18 years ago, the judge looked at me like I was on drugs. Didn't get the concept at all that kids love their mother, they hate their father, what else is there to know? Anyway, about just a few years ago, I got a call from this guy who said his name was Dr. So-and-so. And he said, I think I saw you. I think you saw me when I was 6 years of age. My father's name is such and such. Oh, by the way, I remember the guy's last name. And what started with that, I then found out that she had dumped the second husband and alienated the second husband from her children, and now she was on to the third alienation. So yeah, and guess what? I get a call a few months. So we get the father back with his killed children. Remember what I said, that it's not, it's going to happen. It's there. They were crying in each other's arms within. I helped the reunion. They were crying in each other's arms within 5 minutes. 5 minutes. The next thing that happened was, lo and behold, I get a call from the third husband. I mean, I could retire on this case. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, it happens. It happens. So you've got to be prepared to say, this is hideous, and I'm not going to die anytime soon, and I'm going to have to be patient, and I can't emotionally tantrum. Getting depressed doesn't help. Getting angry doesn't help. Getting in control of your emotions helps a great deal. And recognize that you are not powerless, but you are not all-powerful. But you can hope, and perhaps even dream, and maybe even it will happen, that one day, out of the blue, somebody's going to call you and say, Grandma, or Mum, I need to talk to you. Because life is like that. Who wants to?